Hello and welcome to Tomi Talks TV. I have one singular goal with this show, and that is to help you make smarter decisions so that you can have better relationships. I'd like to start again by saying a massive, massive thank you for all your likes and your shares and your comments on Facebook, on Instagram, on YouTube. I really, really appreciate you because you continue to help us spread the message further faster. So thank you very much indeed. I'd also like to give a very special shout out to those of you that follow me on YouTube. It's such a great place to go and find all my videos. So if you don't yet follow me on YouTube, please go to YouTube, find my channel, Tomi Toluhi, or just Google Tomi Talks and my channel will come up. And then you can like and subscribe. And then also click the notifications button so that you will never have to miss another one of my messages again. Now, what I wanted to do today was to share with you the second part of what I started sharing last week. So last week I started talking about the 7 myths of marriage, and I said essentially that a myth is sort of like a widely held belief or idea that is false. So an idea that a lot of people have about something, but it turns out to be false. And so these are myths of marriage, ideas that people have about marriage, but they are not actually accurate. And last week I shared the first 4 myths. The first one that I shared about was the I am good enough just as I am myth, which essentially says, well, I'm fine as I am. If you married me as I am, then you should accept me as I am. I don't need to change. I don't need to improve. I don't need to learn. I am what I am. You don't get the best of marriage if you approach marriage like that. So I shared on that last week. The second one that I shared on last week was the whole idea of criticism brings change. That is a myth. If you constantly bombard your spouse with criticism, that does not produce change. It produces resistance. So I talked about that extensively last week. The third one that I talked about last week was the mind reading myth. So essentially that myth that says that, well, if my spouse loves me, then they should know exactly what it is without me, what I need rather, without me having to communicate my needs. Your spouse is not a mind reader. They're not God. Only God knows your needs without you actually articulating them. And even God says, you should come and pray and speak your needs, even though He knows what your needs are. So, you need to express what your needs are to your spouse. And then the last one I shared with you last week was the say it as it is myth, which essentially is, well, if my spouse is my soulmate, then I can say whatever it is I want to say when I'm upset, and they've got to just accept it. No, like I shared last week, where your mouth goes, your marriage goes. So you've got to be very careful about how you express yourself in marriage. Now, today I'm going to start from number 5. And the 5th myth I wanted to talk to you about is this: the myth that my feelings have to change first. Now, what do I mean by that? Essentially, what that means is that, I must feel better about my spouse before I begin to treat them better. And usually it's people who maybe they've been hurt by their spouse that buy into this myth. Maybe their spouse has done something that has hurt them, they're feeling offended with their spouse, and then they feel like, well, until my feelings change, I can't do anything about this. It is what it is, and I've got to wait for my feelings to improve first before I actually begin to treat my spouse right. But you see, the challenge is this. Scientifically speaking, it has been proven that it is easier for us to change our behavior than it is for us to change our feelings. I want that to sink in. It is easier to change your behavior than it is for you to change your feelings. And a lot of times what happens is that when we change our behavior, then our feelings catch up and they follow on from our behavior. But if we're waiting until we feel better, until we feel like forgiving before we can forgive, until we feel loving before we love, then we will never really experience the fullness of what it is that God wants us to experience in marriage. So what I'm saying is this: yes, you've been hurt. You've been offended. Maybe your spouse has done something that really, really hurt you. Go before God and place it before God. It's God that commands us to forgive. And He says if we expect to be forgiven, then we should be prepared to forgive as well. Go before God and lay it before God and say, Lord, I don't necessarily feel like this, but I'm making my mind up to forgive. So once you've made the decision to forgive, then your actions should follow. You should have actions that demonstrate that you have forgiven. So you should begin to behave like you've forgiven your spouse, and then your feelings will catch up later. Don't wait for your feelings to make you feel forgiving before you then suddenly think, okay, now I can actually act forgiven, because it will never really happen. That's one of the key ways to release hurt and pain in our lives. So make up your minds. I'm not going to wait for my feelings. I'm going to make up my mind to do what it is I know I need to do in this marriage in spite of my feelings. So in other words, what I'm saying is this: act more loving than you feel, and your feelings will catch up later. So that's one of the key things that we need to address when we're not feeling right about our marriage. So that was the fifth myth. The sixth myth is this: the myth of 50-50, or the 50-50 deal myth. And this one is simply thinking that, you see, well, marriage is a 50-50 partnership. Marriage is not a 50-50 partnership. You see, the reality is that circumstances and individuals are far too complex for us to think that we can maintain equal inputs into a marriage throughout the course of that marriage. And if we buy into this myth, what happens is that, we keep placing expectations on our spouse, and then we lose sight of the beauty of the marriage because we're thinking, well, they've not done what I expected them to do, and all that. I'm doing my part, they're not doing my part exactly, their part exactly as they should. So 50-50 is a myth. 50-50 love is potentially, I think, one of the most deceptive concepts of love that there is, because it feels like it's perfectly, acceptable. After all, if I do my part, you should do your part. If I scratch your back, you should scratch my back. That all makes sense. But the thing is that when people buy into this whole myth, then subconsciously they expect that marriage should be like a contractual relationship. But you see, at the end of the day, marriage does not work by contracts, because even though it sounds like a fair proposition, unfortunately, life is not always fair. That's the reality, that if you live long enough, you will discover that life is not always fair. So what happens, for instance, if you're part of the marriage as well? I bring in my finances, my spouse brings in their finances, and then at some point in time your spouse loses their job, and they're trying to get another job, and they're struggling at that particular point in time. What do you do in that kind of situation? Because 50-50 breaks down in that sort of situation. Or what if, for instance, all of a sudden your spouse is facing, a health challenge. Yes, you expect them to meet your sexual needs, but then at that particular point in time, because of the health challenge they're experiencing, they can't meet your needs. So what do you do in that kind of situation? In that kind of situation, you've got to go above and beyond in your love for your spouse. And that's exactly where 50-50 breaks down. 50-50 love is just storybook love, but it cannot survive the realities of marriage. I'm saying that, when you approach marriage, both of you should approach marriage with the mindset of going 100%. I'm giving my spouse 100%, and I'm not looking to see what they're going to do in return. Is that to say that your spouse should take you for granted, and because of that they shouldn't do what they should be doing in marriage because you've decided to go 100%? That's not what I'm saying. It's not an excuse for taking your spouse for granted. But at the end of the day, the Bible, when it talks about marriage, it talks about marriage as a covenant. And a covenant simply means that I have made up my mind, I'm going to uphold my part of this relationship. Because when we go for the whole 50-50, then we become victims of our own expectations. And then when challenges come in marriage, we don't know how to cope with them. It can be really difficult if your spouse cannot meet the financial needs of the home and that particular season, or meet your sexual needs, or meet your emotional needs, or whatever other need it is that you feel they can't meet at that moment. Maybe they're facing stress at work, and they don't seem to be bringing their best into the marriage, or whatever it is that they're facing at that particular point in time. What I'm saying is this: life is in seasons. And marriage is also in seasons. The fact that you're going through a difficult season now doesn't mean that it will last forever. So don't withdraw your love and your effort in the marriage simply because your spouse is in a position where they're struggling to do all that they had hoped that they could do in the marriage. Keep doing your part and keep trusting God and praying for your spouse and encouraging them, and trusting God that they will pass through this season and they will come out on the other side. And that's the way to approach marriage. Don't go to marriage with a 50-50 mindset. Go into marriage with the mindset, I'm going to give everything that I know that God wants me to give in this marriage. There's no point in keeping score in marriage, because we don't get the best out of marriage that way. Both parties should approach marriage with 100% mindset, and at the same time, don't take advantage and think, oh well, I can just do whatever it is I want to do in this marriage because my spouse will give 100%. No, when we both give 100% in the marriage, then we experience the best of God in the marriage. Now, the last one that I wanted to share with you is the myth that marriage is the ultimate answer. Now, this one, when we are newly married, newly wedded couples, a lot of us tend to buy into this myth that, marriage will solve all my problems. It's the answer to all my needs. Marriage is going to make me deliriously happy. I will never have another day of unhappiness in my life again because, now I'm married. And what happens is that we expect our spouse to be the answer to all our needs. And we place unrealistic expectations upon them. And we think that, look, because we're married, we're going to be constantly on a high of happiness. But you see, the thing is this: your spouse wants to be there for you. They don't want to be your oxygen. They don't want to be your oxygen. There are some needs that, only your spouse can legitimately meet. And I completely get that. So your sexual needs, for instance, no one else can legitimately meet those needs apart from your spouse. Your deep emotional needs, so talking about the deepest core of your being, no one else can share those things except your spouse. So yes, you have, every reason to expect that, you can focus those needs on your spouse. But at the same time, what I'm saying is this: don't place expectations on your spouse that only God can possibly meet, because it's only God that can meet your needs 100% of the time. So we've got to cultivate our relationship with God to the point where, we can pour out our deepest desires to God, and then the things that we look to our spouse for are just the things that, our spouse can meet, rather than placing all the expectations, of life on your spouse. Your spouse is not the air that you breathe. Look to God and say, you are the air that I breathe. You are the song that I sing. You are the reason that I live. And then your spouse will be able to do the things that, they should do in the marriage without, unnecessarily heavy expectations. And then another thing to say is, don't cut off your family and your friends just because you're married to someone, because you think that they should meet all of your needs. Your spouse is supposed to be your best friend. My husband is my best friend, and absolutely he's the first person I would think about when I want to share certain things. Anything good happens in my life, or even if I'm facing a challenge, he's the first person that I want to talk to. But it doesn't mean that he's the only one that I ever talk to. You should cultivate other relationships, with friends, with family as well. Your spouse may not like to chat all the time about, baby clothes or or sports, or whatever it is that interests you. So find somebody else that can be the outlet for that. But then that leaves your spouse free to be the best that they can be in the marriage. Marriage will not make us happy if we don't commit to having a full and active life. If we focus everything on that one person and we feel like, oh, they've got to meet every single need that drops in my mind, then it doesn't work. It really doesn't work. But when we're reasonable in our expectations of our spouse, and we cultivate a full and a happy life, that's full of lots of other things. You have your hobbies, the other things that you like to do, and all that. Then it makes marriage a joy. Well, I hope this has helped you. And those are the 7 myths that I've shared. If you didn't watch last week's message, I want to encourage you to go back and watch last week's as well. So if this has helped you, please leave me a message on Facebook, on Instagram, on YouTube, or wherever it is you're watching. And if you've got a question you would like me to answer, then head on over to tomitalks.com/ask, and I'll answer your question next time. See you next time. Bye-bye.